The Iron Maiden never existed. You're standing in a dusty chamber in Nuremberg, Germany. The year is 1793. Before you towers a 7-foot iron cabinet shaped like a woman's body. The curator gestures dramatically and opens the doors. Inside, dozens of rusted spikes point inward from every angle. He explains how medieval executioners would close the doors slowly, the spikes piercing through eyes, chest, stomach, designed to maximize pain while avoiding immediate death. This is the Iron Maiden, he says, the ultimate symbol of medieval cruelty. Except there's one problem. It never existed. Not in the Middle Ages. Not in any castle dungeon. Not anywhere. The entire device was fabricated in the late 18th century, assembled from random parts and sold as authentic medieval horror. And yet, for over 200 years, museums displayed them. Textbooks described them. Tour guides recounted their gruesome history. The lie became so embedded that even today, millions believe the Iron Maiden was real. The first Iron Maiden appeared at a Nuremberg exhibition in 1793. Museum curator Johann Philipp Siebenkees presented what he claimed was an ancient torture device recovered from medieval dungeons. By the 1800s, Iron Maidens were appearing in collections across Europe and America. The Tower of London acquired one in 1890. Ripley's Believe It or Not featured them prominently. They became the iconic image of medieval barbarity, proof that the Dark Ages were truly dark. But here's what doesn't add up. No Iron Maiden exists in any medieval document, painting, legal record, or archaeological site dated before 1793. Not one. German legal historian Wolfgang Schild published definitive research in the 1980s, showing zero medieval evidence. The Nuremberg Iron Maiden, when examined closely, was assembled from parts of different centuries, possibly including fragments of a 16th century sarcophagus and random metal spikes added later. Medieval torture was brutal, but it was also highly regulated and documented. The 1515 criminal code, known as the Constitutio Criminalis Bambergensis, lists approved torture methods in excruciating detail. The rack, the wheel, thumbscrews, strappado. Every legal instrument of pain is cataloged. The Iron Maiden? Completely absent. Medieval torture manuals, and there were many, never mentioned such a device. Court records from 1200 to 1600 document thousands of torture sessions. Not once does an Iron Maiden appear. Medieval authorities kept meticulous records because torture was a legal process, requiring documentation. When someone was broken on the wheel or stretched on the rack, scribes recorded the method, duration, and results. These documents survive by the thousands in archives across Europe, and in all those pages, in all those graphic descriptions, there is absolute silence about Iron Maidens. The first literary reference to the device appears in 1793, the exact same year the first physical example was displayed. That's not a coincidence. It's a smoking gun. In 1997, the British Museum confirmed their Iron Maiden was a 19th century construction, not a medieval artifact. Amnesty International's museum removed their Iron Maiden display in 2001 after historical review proved it was fraudulent. Yet the myth persists. Movies still feature them. Horror attractions display them. The image is too powerful to kill. The mainstream explanation frames the Iron Maiden as an authentic medieval torture device used from the 12th through 16th centuries across Germany and Eastern Europe. Tour guides describe the mechanics, how victims were slowly closed inside, how the spikes were positioned to pierce vital organs while keeping the person alive as long as possible. It's presented as evidence of medieval savagery, a time when human life held little value and cruelty was entertainment. But the complete absence from contemporary sources is deafening. Medieval Europeans illustrated everything. Torture chambers appear in hundreds of period paintings and woodcuts showing racks, wheels, thumbscrews, strappado frames. Artists didn't shy away from depicting brutality. Yet never once do we see an Iron Maiden. Not in any manuscript, not in any illumination, not in any legal illustration. Historians like Wolfgang Schild and others now argue convincingly that the Iron Maiden was a Romantic era fabrication. The late 18th and 19th centuries were obsessed with Gothic horror and medieval darkness. Museums competed for the most dramatic and disturbing exhibits. Someone, possibly Siebenkees himself, likely assembled disparate pieces, perhaps a religious statue or decorative sarcophagus, added iron spikes, invented a dark backstory, and sold it as authentic medieval torture equipment. The lie spread because it confirmed what people wanted to believe about the Dark Ages. It made their own era seem more civilized and enlightened by comparison. The Iron Maiden worked too well as propaganda. It painted medieval Europe as a nightmare of cruelty, making the Enlightenment look like salvation. It suggested that human progress was linear, that we had evolved beyond such barbarism. The truth is messier. Medieval torture was real and horrific, but the Iron Maiden wasn't part of it. From a torture device that never existed, we crossed the Atlantic to a discovery that never happened. Columbus didn't discover America. October 12th, 1492. Christopher Columbus steps off the Santa Maria onto white sand beaches in what we now call the Bahamas. He plants a Spanish flag and claims the land for Ferdinand and Isabella. History books call this moment the discovery of America, the day the New World entered human consciousness. It became a defining narrative of Western civilization, celebrated with parades and a federal holiday. But standing on that beach, watching Columbus plant his flag, were the Lucayan people. They had lived on those islands for centuries. Their ancestors had crossed vast oceans, navigated by stars, and built thriving communities. And 500 years before Columbus, Norse explorers had already constructed permanent settlements on North American soil, complete with iron forges and timber halls. The story unraveled in 1960 when Norwegian explorer Helge Ingstad and archaeologist Anne Stein Ingstad discovered Norse ruins at L'Anse aux Meadows in Newfoundland, Canada. Over 8 years of excavation from 1961 to 1968, they uncovered 8 Norse buildings with unmistakable Scandinavian construction techniques. Radiocarbon dating placed the settlement around 1000 CE, nearly 5 centuries before Columbus set sail. The evidence was irrefutable. Iron rivets matching Norse shipbuilding techniques, sod walls built in the Icelandic style, a forge with iron slag deposits, artifacts that could only have come from medieval Scandinavia. In 1978, UNESCO declared L'Anse aux Meadows a World Heritage Site, acknowledging it as proof that Europeans reached North America half a millennium before Columbus. But even this misses the larger deception. How can anyone discover a land where millions already live? Indigenous population estimates for the Americas in 1492 range from 50 million to 100 million people. They had built cities that rivaled European capitals. Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, had sophisticated aqueducts and a population larger than any European city of its time. The Inca Empire stretched thousands of miles with road systems that would impress modern engineers. The Mississippian city of Cahokia had pyramidal mounds and a population of 20,000 at its peak, centuries before Columbus. Norse sagas written around 1200 CE, the Saga of Eric the Red and the Saga of the Greenlanders, describe voyages to a land called Vinland, approximately 500 years before Columbus. For centuries, scholars dismissed these as mythology. The L'Anse aux Meadows discovery proved the sagas were records of actual events. Columbus himself never set foot on the North American mainland. He explored Caribbean islands and touched the coasts of Central and South America, but he never reached what would become the United States or Canada. The continent wasn't even named for him. That honor went to Amerigo Vespucci, who mapped the South American coast and recognized it as a separate continent, not the eastern edge of Asia, as Columbus believed. For generations, American schoolchildren learned that Columbus discovered America in 1492, marking the beginning of the New World. This narrative positioned Europe as the source of civilization and progress, Columbus as the great explorer who connected two hemispheres. Columbus Day became a United States federal holiday in 1937, cementing the mythology in national identity. But the word discovery itself erases truth. It implies empty land waiting to be found, ignoring the sophisticated civilizations that had existed for millennia. The Vikings didn't discover America either. People had been there for at least 15,000 years, possibly much longer, having crossed from Asia during the last ice age and spread across two continents. The Columbus myth served explicit political purposes. It justified European colonization by framing it as bringing civilization to undiscovered territory. It erased indigenous claims to the land by suggesting they were just inhabitants, not true possessors of the continent. It promoted European exceptionalism by positioning Columbus as the bridge between ignorance and knowledge, darkness and enlightenment. The discovery narrative reframes invasion as exploration, conquest as connection, genocide as unfortunate but inevitable collision of progress with primitiveness. By teaching children that Columbus discovered America, educators taught them that the land was empty before Europeans arrived, that indigenous peoples didn't truly possess or understand what they had, that colonization was discovery rather than theft. Some historians argue we should celebrate Columbus for European indigenous contact, for connecting hemispheres that had been separated for millennia. But contact implies mutual exchange between equals. What followed was systematic destruction of entire civilizations, enslavement, disease, and cultural genocide. From a false discovery, we turn to a false belief, one medieval people supposedly held, but actually never did. Medieval people knew Earth was round. Picture the scene. It's 1492, the same year as Columbus. He stands before Queen Isabella of Spain, arguing that he can reach Asia by sailing west. Educated advisors mock him, insisting the world is flat. He'll sail off the edge, they warn. His crew threatens mutiny, terrified they'll reach the boundary where the ocean pours into infinite void. This dramatic confrontation appears in textbooks, movies, popular biographies. Washington Irving immortalized it in his 1828 biography of Columbus. It's a defining image of one man's reason against medieval ignorance. It's also completely false. Medieval scholars not only knew Earth was round, they had calculated its circumference with remarkable accuracy. The flat Earth myth is a modern invention, created in the 19th century to make the Middle Ages look primitive. The Greek mathematician Eratosthenes calculated Earth's circumference in 240 BCE, achieving 98% accuracy using nothing but shadows, geometry, and brilliant reasoning. His work was preserved and studied throughout the Middle Ages. Medieval scholars read Ptolemy's Almagest, written around 150 CE, which assumed a spherical Earth and calculated the positions of stars based on that geometry. Thomas Aquinas, the most influential medieval theologian, wrote extensively in his Summa Theologica during the 1270s about Earth's spherical nature. He treated it as established fact, not controversial theory. Dante's Divine Comedy, written in 1320, describes Earth as a sphere with Jerusalem at one point and hell extending through the center to the opposite side, where Mount Purgatory rises. The entire cosmology of the poem only works if Earth is spherical. John de Sacrobosco's textbook, De Sphera Mundi, written around 1230, taught spherical Earth in universities across Europe for over 400 years. It explained lunar eclipses, the position of constellations at different latitudes, and why ships disappear hull first over the horizon. This was standard curriculum from Paris to Oxford to Bologna. Medieval maps after 1000 CE consistently showed Earth as a globe. The TO maps used a circular format not because they thought Earth was flat, but because they were schematic representations showing the three known continents arranged around the Mediterranean. They were like modern subway maps, topologically simplified, but not claiming to show true geography. So where did Columbus's opposition come from? Not from shape, but from size. The real debate was over Earth's circumference. Columbus claimed the distance from Spain to Asia going west was short enough to sail with 15th century ships. Learned advisors said no. They had better calculations of Earth's size, and they were right. Earth is far larger than Columbus claimed. The scholars who opposed his voyage weren't ignorant flat earthers. They were correct, and he was wrong. Only the unexpected presence of two continents Columbus didn't know existed saved him from dying at sea. But if medieval scholars knew Earth was round, why does the flat Earth myth persist? Because it was deliberately created. Washington Irving fabricated the flat Earth opposition in his Columbus biography to add dramatic tension. Later, John William Draper's History of the Conflict Between Religion and Science, published in 1874, and Andrew Dixon White's History of the Warfare of Science with Theology, published in 1896, cemented the myth as anti-religious propaganda. These Enlightenment and Victorian thinkers needed the Middle Ages to look ignorant to make their own era seem enlightened. They needed the Church to appear anti-science, to position secular reason as progress. The flat Earth myth served that purpose perfectly. Paint medieval Christians as believing the world was flat, then show how brave scientists proved them wrong. It's a compelling narrative. It's also fiction. Historian Jeffrey Burton Russell documented in his 1991 book, Inventing the Flat Earth, how the myth was constructed in the 19th century and spread despite having no medieval foundation. Yet even now, after 40 years of historical debunking, surveys show significant percentages of people believe medieval scholars thought Earth was flat. The myth persists because it confirms biases about religious ignorance and scientific enlightenment. It makes the past look primitive, which makes the present feel advanced. It's comforting to believe we've progressed from darkness to light, from superstition to reason. The truth is messier. Medieval universities were centers of learning where astronomy, geometry, and natural philosophy flourished. The Renaissance didn't rescue science from religious darkness. It built on centuries of medieval scholarship. From myths about medieval knowledge, we descend into the arena where gladiators supposedly died with every battle. Gladiators rarely fought to death. 80 CE, opening day of the Colosseum in Rome. 60,000 Romans packed the greatest amphitheater ever built. Two gladiators clash in the arena below, sword against shield, blood spattering the sand. One falls. The crowd roars. Thumbs turn downward. The emperor nods. The victor raises his blade for the killing blow. This scene, repeated in 100 Hollywood films, is embedded in how we imagine Rome. Brutal spectacles where men fought to death for entertainment. Disposable lives thrown away for bloodthirsty crowds. Except archaeological evidence tells a completely different story. Most gladiators were expensive investments who rarely fought to death. The deathmatch myth reveals more about our assumptions about Roman decadence than Roman reality. Archaeological analysis of gladiator graveyards revolutionized understanding in the 1990s. Karl Groschmidt and Fabian Kahns studied the gladiator cemetery at Ephesus in Turkey and found that while 68% of gladiators died between ages 20 and 30, many died from disease rather than combat. The bone evidence showed healed fractures, proof that gladiators survived multiple fights and received medical care between bouts. The economics are stark. Training a gladiator cost the equivalent of $500,000 or more in modern terms. Housing, food, specialized training, quality weapons, medical care, it all added up. Gladiators weren't slaves thrown into arenas to die. They were athletes in whom significant capital had been invested. Galen, the most famous physician of the Roman Empire, served as doctor to gladiators from 157 to 161 CE. His medical writings describe detailed surgical procedures, setting fractures, stitching wounds, treating infections. This level of care doesn't make sense for disposable fighters. It makes sense for valuable assets expected to fight again. Death rates in gladiatorial combat are estimated at 1 in 10 to 1 in 5 matches, not every fight. Many gladiators were slaves, but successful ones could earn freedom through repeated victories and prize money. Some gladiators became wealthy celebrities. Graffiti found in Pompeii shows gladiators had devoted fans, particularly among women. They were sex symbols and sports stars. Marcus Junkelmann's experimental archaeology in the 1990s used reconstructed gladiator equipment to demonstrate actual fighting techniques. The weapons and armor prioritized skill displays over quick kills. Matches were choreographed to showcase different fighting styles. A murmillo with sword and large shield versus a retiarius with trident and net created dramatic contrast. The entertainment was in the technique, the near misses, the skill, not just in death. Economic records show that fight promoters paid substantial compensation to gladiator owners when fighters died. This created strong financial disincentives for lethal matches. Killing a trained gladiator was like totaling a Ferrari to entertain a crowd. Technically possible, but economically insane. The standard image presented in popular culture frames every arena combat as a fight to death. This confirms assumptions about Roman barbarity and moral decline. Rome as bloodthirsty empire demanding death for entertainment. Gladiators as disposable criminals or slaves with lives held cheap. But gladiatorial combat had rules, referees called summa rudis, who could stop fights, and doctors standing by to provide immediate care. Matches were violent, absolutely, and people did die. But trained gladiators were too valuable to waste. Death matches were more like modern boxing or mixed martial arts than slaughter sport. The spectacle came from skill, courage, drama, and occasional but not constant death. The confusion comes partly from condemned criminals. The Romans did execute prisoners in the arena, often through damnatio ad bestias, being thrown to wild animals. These spectacles were brutal and intended to be fatal. But these weren't gladiator matches. They were executions staged as entertainment, a different category entirely. The deathmatch myth says more about us than about Rome. We want to believe ancient civilizations were more barbaric than ours, that we've evolved morally. It's comforting to imagine Romans as bloodthirsty savages, demanding death with every fight. The reality is more complex. Violence, yes. Spectacle, absolutely. But not mindless slaughter. From the arena, where death was rarer than we thought, we travel north to warriors whose helmets were never what we pictured. Vikings never wore horned helmets. 793 CE, the coast of Northumbria, England. Longships slice through morning mist and beach on the shore. Warriors leap into the surf, axes raised, their horned helmets silhouetted against the rising sun as they charge the monastery at Lindisfarne. This image, the Viking with horned helmet, appears on everything from football team logos to heavy metal album covers. It's the universal symbol of Norse raiders. It's also completely wrong. Archaeologists have found dozens of Viking Age helmets across Scandinavia. Not one has horns. The horned helmet myth emerged in 19th century Romantic nationalism, particularly with the 1876 premiere of Richard Wagner's opera cycle, Der Ring des Nibelungen. Costume designer Karl Emil Dupler created horned helmets for the production to make the characters look more exotic and mythological. The design was visually striking and caught public imagination. Earlier, Swedish artist Gustav Malmström had illustrated the Frithiof saga in 1825 with horned Viking warriors. The combination of these artistic choices exploded into popular culture. But the archaeological record is unambiguous. Only one complete Viking Age helmet has ever been found. The Geirmundbu helmet, discovered in Norway, and dated to approximately 970 CE. It's a rounded iron helmet with a simple nose guard. No horns. Other helmet fragments found at sites like Lokrum and Gela show similar construction. Functional, well-designed, horn-free. Bronze Age Scandinavian artifacts from 1500 to 1100 BCE, more than 1500 years before the Viking Age, do show ceremonial horned helmets. These were likely used in religious rituals, not combat. But these predate Vikings by millennia and were never used in battle. The tactical absurdity of horned helmets is obvious to anyone who thinks about it for 30 seconds. A horn gives your enemy a perfect handle to grab, twist, and snap your neck. In close combat, that's a fatal design flaw. Viking Age helmets that survive are practical, designed to deflect blows and protect the skull. Horns would make them deadlier to the wearer than to the enemy. Medieval sources describe Viking armor and weapons, but never mention horns. The Bayeux Tapestry, created in the 1070s to commemorate the Norman conquest, shows Norman warriors who were descendants of Vikings. Their helmets are conical with nose guards. No horns. Norwegian historian Hjalmar Falk debunked the horned Viking image as early as 1924, but the myth was already too embedded in popular culture to dislodge. By then, horned helmets had become visual shorthand for Vikings. They made Norse warriors look more exotic, primitive, fearsome. The image differentiated them from other medieval warriors and created instant recognition. The myth served 19th century nationalist mythology. Scandinavian nations were reclaiming Viking heritage as Europe built nation-states based on ethnic identity. An exotic, powerful image helped establish Vikings as fierce ancestors worth celebrating. Wagner's opera fused Germanic mythology with theatrical spectacle, and the horned helmet became the symbol. Once embedded in textbooks and museum displays, the myth fed itself. Even after historians corrected the record, the visual image proved too powerful. Sports teams kept using horned Vikings as mascots. Hollywood kept putting horns on helmets. The Minnesota Vikings football team, founded in 1961, used a horned helmet logo despite the historical evidence being clear by then. The horned helmet is pure fantasy, but it reveals how pop culture creates history more powerful than truth. A costume designer's artistic choice in 1876 became historical fact in public consciousness, resistant to correction even after a century of archaeological evidence. From Norse warriors misrepresented by their headgear, we turn to a Roman emperor misrepresented by an instrument that didn't exist yet. Nero's fiddle didn't exist. July 18th to 19th, 64 CE. Flames consume Rome. 10 of the city's 14 districts burn. Thousands die. Smoke chokes the sky. And according to legend, on a distant hill, Emperor Nero stands with his fiddle, playing music while his capital turns to ash. Nero fiddled while Rome burned became history's perfect metaphor for indifferent tyranny, callous leadership during crisis. It's been repeated for centuries in speeches, essays, warnings about leaders who ignore disaster. There's just one problem. Fiddles wouldn't be invented for another 1,500 years. The violin family of instruments emerged in 16th century Italy, approximately 1486 years after Nero's death in 68 CE. Ancient Rome had musical instruments: lyres, citheras, flutes, drums, various string instruments plucked or strummed, but no bowed string instruments. The technology and design didn't exist. Roman historians Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio all wrote extensively about the Great Fire of Rome. None mention a fiddle. Tacitus, writing around 116 CE in his Annals, states that Nero was at Antium, approximately 30 miles from Rome, when the fire started. He rushed back to the city and opened his palaces to refugees, organized relief efforts, and oversaw reconstruction. Suetonius, writing in the 12 Caesars, claims Nero sang about the fall of Troy while watching the fire, but doesn't mention any instrument. This may have been propaganda. Comparing Rome's burning to Troy's destruction would have been in terrible taste, but it's not fiddling. Cassius Dio, writing around 230 CE, over a century and a half after the event, wrote that Nero viewed the conflagration from the Tower of Maecenas and sang. Again, no mention of a fiddle or any instrument. So where did the fiddle come from? The story evolved through centuries of retelling. Medieval and Renaissance writers knew violins and fiddles. When translating or retelling stories about Nero singing, they updated the image to include the instrument familiar to their audiences. The metaphor was too perfect. A leader playing music during disaster. Rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic, a modern equivalent. The phrase Nero fiddled while Rome burned entered English around the 17th century, combining earlier accusations that Nero sang during the fire with the more familiar image of fiddle playing. It stuck because it's memorable and encapsulates a specific type of leadership failure. Ancient historians were happy to accuse Nero of terrible things. Tacitus, Suetonius, and Dio all report that many Romans believed Nero started the fire himself to clear land for his grandiose building projects. They record that he blamed Christians for the fire, leading to brutal persecutions. These historians had no motivation to make Nero look good. If he had done something as callous as playing music during the disaster, they would have reported it accurately. The standard narrative presents Nero fiddling as a literal historical event, symbol of imperial decadence and madness. It appears in textbooks as fact, used to illustrate Roman decline and tyrannical psychology. But the timeline makes it impossible. Tacitus places Nero 30 miles away when the fire started. Ancient historians describe singing, not instrumental music. And most damning, the instrument didn't exist for another millennium and a half. The story evolved from political propaganda. Nero was deeply unpopular with the senatorial class who wrote the histories. They accused him of many crimes, some probably true. The singing accusation may have been metaphorical. He was known for artistic pretensions and had performed in public, shocking Roman sensibilities about imperial dignity. Medieval writers updated the image. Renaissance writers spread it, and eventually it became a perfect idiom. The myth persists because it's a perfect metaphor that happens to be built on an impossible foundation. It captures a specific type of leadership failure so perfectly that factual accuracy seems secondary. From an emperor who never played an instrument that didn't exist, we cross the Atlantic to executions that never happened the way everyone remembers. Salem witches weren't burned at the stake. 1692 to 1693, Salem Village, Massachusetts. The accused woman stands bound to a wooden stake. Flames rise around her as townspeople watch, her screams mixing with prayers and accusations of witchcraft. This scene of Salem's pyres lighting the New England night appears in countless depictions of the witch trials. Books, movies, paintings, all show the burning. It never happened. Not once. In Salem, the accused were hanged. Burning at the stake was a European practice that never crossed the Atlantic to English colonies. Historical records of the Salem witch trials are extensive and precise. Court documents, execution records, eyewitness accounts all survive in archives. 19 people were executed during the trials. 14 women and 5 men were hanged at Gallows Hill. One man, Giles Corey, was pressed to death under heavy stones on September 19, 1692, because he refused to enter a plea. 0 were burned. The execution dates are documented: June 10th, July 19th, August 19th, and September 22nd, 1692. Each person hanged was recorded by name. Bridget Bishop, first to die on June 10th. Rebecca Nurse, Sarah Good, Elizabeth Howe, Susanna Martin, and Sarah Wilds on July 19th. The records are meticulous because these were legal proceedings following English colonial law. English common law mandated hanging for felonies, including witchcraft. Burning at the stake was illegal in England and English colonies. Continental Europe burned heretics and witches. The Inquisition preferred burning, and German witch hunts used pyres, but England did not. This legal distinction is clear and consistent. The Salem witch trials. Tercentenary in 1992 identified the execution site at Gallows Hill with historical documentation. Recent archaeological work has confirmed the location. There's no ambiguity in the records about method of execution. 5 additional accused died in prison awaiting trial, including Sarah Osborne and others who succumbed to harsh conditions. But they weren't executed. Historian Mary Beth Norton's definitive account, In the Devil's Snare, published in 2002, details each execution method with primary source documentation. So why does the burning image dominate? The confusion stems from conflating European witch hunts with American trials. Images of Joan of Arc burning in 1431, Inquisition auto da fe in Spain, continental witch burnings from the 15th through 17th centuries. These are visually dramatic and memorable. Burning suggests religious fanaticism more viscerally than hanging. The methods blur together in collective memory under the general category of witch execution. Popular culture reinforces the error. When filmmakers want to show witch execution, they choose burning because it's more visually dramatic and horrifying than hanging. Arthur Miller's The Crucible, the most famous work about Salem, doesn't explicitly describe execution methods, allowing productions to interpret visually. Many stage and film versions have included burning imagery. The standard narrative depicts Salem witch trials with pyres and flames, aligning them with European witch hunt iconography. This makes Salem feel more distant, more barbaric, more fanatic than it actually was. The trials were terrible: mass hysteria, false accusations, legal travesty, but they followed twisted legal procedures of their time, not mob burnings. Burning carries specific symbolic weight. It suggests purifying fire, religious zealotry, medieval darkness. Hanging is more bureaucratic, more legally procedural. By remembering Salem with flames instead of gallows, we make it feel more primitive and religiously extreme than the actual events. The myth erases the specific legal context of English colonial justice. Massachusetts Bay Colony operated under English common law, with courts, judges, formal trials. The proceedings were unjust, the evidence absurd, the conclusions deadly. But they weren't mob burnings. They were legal executions following prescribed method. From executions misremembered, we enter a Roman building whose name became one of history's most enduring mistranslations. Vomitoriums weren't for vomiting. 80 CE, dedication of the Colosseum in Rome. Massive archways surround the amphitheater's outer wall. Through these passageways, crowds of 60,000 flow in and out, filling and emptying the stadium in minutes. Romans called these passages vomitoria because they allowed crowds to spew forth. But ask most people today what a vomitorium was, and they'll describe a room where rich Romans went to purge their meals so they could feast again. It's the ultimate symbol of Roman decadence and excess, proof of imperial moral rot. Except vomitoriums had nothing to do with vomiting. They were exits. The mistranslation reveals more about Victorian moralizing than Roman reality. The Latin word vomitorium derives from vomere, meaning to spew forth. It's an architectural term for passageways that allow large crowds to enter and exit quickly. Vitruvius, the famous Roman architect who lived around 30 to 15 BCE, uses the term vomitoria in his treatise De Architectura when describing stadium passages. The meaning is clear and technical. Entrances and exits designed for crowd flow. The Colosseum had 80 vomitoria, entrance and exit passages that allowed the massive crowd to disperse in minutes. Roman architectural texts consistently use the term for passageways, never for rooms related to digestion or purging. Modern stadiums still use the architectural term vomitory for spectator passages, preserving the original meaning. Romans did feast lavishly, and wealthy Romans sometimes used emetics. Seneca and other Roman writers describe excessive eating and occasional purging, but they didn't have special rooms for it, and they certainly didn't call them vomitoriums. Medical texts mention emetics as occasional treatments, not regular practices. The mistranslation likely solidified in the 19th and 20th centuries, when classical education declined and fewer people could read Latin fluently. Victorian-era writers, eager to portray Romans as morally dissolute to contrast with their own supposed refinement, seized on a word that sounded like vomit and ran with it. The vomitorium as purge room story spread because it confirmed what people wanted to believe, that Rome fell due to moral decay, that ancient luxury led to degeneracy, that we could draw cautionary lessons from Roman excess. A word that happened to sound like vomit got reinterpreted to fit a moralistic narrative about civilization in decline. Medical historian Roy Porter noted that Victorian moralists conflated separate concepts to demonize Roman culture. Romans did engage in excessive feasting. They did occasionally use emetics, but linking these practices to the architectural term vomitorium was a modern invention. The myth is taught as evidence of Roman decadence. It appears in reference books, textbooks, and popular histories as fact. The narrative fits preconceptions about imperial excess, gluttons eating themselves sick, then purging to continue, a culture so depraved it needed special rooms for vomiting. But Roman architects were clear. Vomitoria were passages. The linguistic confusion is entirely modern. The myth reveals more about those who spread it than about Romans. Victorian and modern moralists needed ancient Rome as cautionary tale. A word that sounded suggestive got reinterpreted, and the fake meaning spread because it was too memorable and too morally useful to correct. The standard explanation treats vomitoriums as historical fact, evidence that Romans had industrialized gluttony. But architectural and historical texts are unanimous. Vomitoria were exits, nothing more. Language creates history as much as events do. A mistranslation becomes fact. A metaphor becomes reality. And centuries later, people confidently describe Roman rooms that never existed. From a Roman word misunderstood, we turn to a French queen's words she never spoke. Marie Antoinette never said, "Let them eat cake." October 1789, Palace of Versailles. Starving Parisians march toward the royal residence. Bread shortages have pushed the city to breaking point. Word reaches Queen Marie Antoinette that her subjects have no bread. According to legend, she responds with aristocratic cluelessness. Let them eat cake. 4 words that sealed her fate, symbolized revolutionary class warfare, and became history's most famous example of out-of-touch privilege. Except, there's no evidence she ever said it. The quote appears in Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Confessions, written around 1765 when Marie Antoinette was 9 years old and hadn't yet arrived in France. Rousseau wrote his Confessions between approximately 1765 and 1770, though it wasn't published until 1782. In the text, he recounts hearing about a great princess who, told that peasants had no bread, said, "Let them eat brioche." He doesn't name anyone. He's describing events from even earlier, possibly the 1740s. Marie Antoinette was born November 2nd, 1755. She was 9 to 14 years old when Rousseau wrote the passage. She arrived in France in May 1770, at age 14, for her marriage to the future Louis XVI. She couldn't have been the source. No contemporary account from Marie Antoinette's actual lifetime mentions the quote. No court diary, no letter, no memoir from anyone who actually knew her records her saying this. The revolutionaries who vilified her and chronicled her every perceived offense never used it as evidence during her trial. If she had actually said something so damning, it would have appeared in the accusations against her. The phrase in French is qu'il mange de la brioche. Brioche is enriched bread made with butter and eggs, not cake. But even this is lost in English translation. The point remains. If bread is scarce, brioche ingredients would be even more scarce. The comment reflects class ignorance, whether it's cake or enriched bread. Historian Antonia Fraser's definitive biography, Marie Antoinette, The Journey, published in 2001, thoroughly debunked the attribution. She traced how the quote became attached to the Queen only decades after her execution, as her image was weaponized for political purposes. The standard narrative presents "let them eat cake" as a real quote that shows Marie Antoinette's disconnect from suffering. It's taught as the quintessential example of aristocratic cluelessness, used in political discourse to this day as shorthand for oblivious privilege. But the timeline makes attribution impossible. Rousseau wrote it before she could have said it. Revolutionary prosecutors never mentioned it. The quote only became hers in the decades after her death in 1793, as her legend solidified. Marie Antoinette was a convenient scapegoat, Austrian-born in a France that distrusted Austria. Young, fashionable, and expensive during economic crisis. Female in a system where Queen's consort had little real power, but maximum visibility. She embodied everything revolutionaries opposed. Attaching the quote to her created the perfect narrative villain. Revolutionary propaganda needed her to be heartless, frivolous, contemptuous of common people. The quote was too perfect not to use. Truth be damned. It spread because people wanted to believe the monarchy was that callous. The reality was more complex. Evidence suggests Marie Antoinette was not particularly cruel or callous. She supported charitable causes, though on a scale that seems absurd given France's poverty. She was politically naive, socially isolated, and made poor decisions. But the cartoon villain of the cake quote doesn't match historical records from those who actually knew her. The myth persists because it encapsulates a specific type of privilege so perfectly that it survives correction. It's used today whenever a leader seems out of touch with suffering. Politicians accuse each other of Marie Antoinette moments. The metaphor is too useful to abandon. Propaganda becomes history. An executed woman becomes an eternal symbol of words she never spoke. And centuries later, we still quote her, confident in our knowledge of something that never happened. From a queen who never spoke the words that defined her, we end with a genius who never failed the way history claims. Einstein never failed math. 1895 to 1900, Switzerland and Germany. The story is told to every struggling student. Albert Einstein, the greatest physicist of the 20th century, failed mathematics in school. If genius struggled with math, maybe grades don't determine destiny. Teachers comfort underperforming students with this narrative. Self-help books cite it as proof that conventional measures miss true intelligence. It appears in motivational speeches and educational materials worldwide. There's only one problem. Einstein was excellent at mathematics from childhood. He mastered calculus by age 15. The myth is completely backwards. The false story may originate from a 1935 Ripley's Believe It or Not column that claimed Einstein failed math. Einstein himself saw it and publicly corrected the record. I never failed in mathematics. Before I was 15, I had mastered differential and integral calculus. But by then, the story had momentum. It was too useful, too comforting, too perfect a narrative to abandon. Einstein's academic records are public and clear. His 1896 Matura diploma, the Swiss graduation certificate, shows he received 6, the highest mark on the Swiss grading scale, in mathematics and physics. His performance in these subjects was exceptional. He did fail the entrance examination to ETH Zurich, the Swiss Federal Polytechnic, in 1895. But he was 2 years younger than other applicants, only 16 years old. He excelled in mathematics and science sections, but performed poorly in languages, botany, and other non-technical subjects. This wasn't mathematical failure. It was a teenager taking a university entrance exam early and struggling with subjects outside his strengths. After a year of additional schooling, Einstein passed the entrance exam and attended ETH. His teacher Heinrich Weber noted Einstein's exceptional mathematical ability, though he also noted Einstein's tendency to skip lectures and study independently, which created tensions. Einstein's miracle year of 1905, when he published revolutionary papers on the photoelectric effect, Brownian motion, special relativity, and mass energy equivalence, required advanced mathematics. You cannot develop special relativity without strong mathematical foundation. His later work on general relativity required even more sophisticated mathematics, including tensor calculus. Biographer Abraham Peiss documented Einstein's academic records thoroughly in his 1982 biography, Subtle is the Lord. The documentation is comprehensive. Einstein excelled at mathematics consistently throughout his education. Part of the confusion may stem from grading system differences. In the German system used in some of Einstein's early schooling, 6 was the highest mark. In other systems, 1 is highest. This could create confusion when records are read without context. But this doesn't explain the complete invention that he failed. The myth serves a function, which is why it persists despite correction. It makes genius relatable. It challenges authority and conventional assessment. It suggests that potential can be missed by traditional measures, that teachers can be wrong, that grades don't tell the whole story. These are useful narratives for education and personal development. The standard story presents Einstein as a failed math student who overcame academic struggle to become genius. It's motivational mythology, suggesting that failure in school doesn't preclude greatness. But Einstein's records show the opposite. He was exceptional in mathematics and physics from early age. The only failure was not getting into university at 16, 2 years early, and that was due to non-STEM subjects and his age, not mathematical ability. The comforting narrative is built on complete fiction. Einstein didn't struggle with math. He mastered it early and thoroughly. His genius wasn't despite mathematical failure, but partly because of mathematical excellence. The myth persists because it serves emotional and pedagogical purposes. It comforts struggling students. It challenges obsession with grades. It humanizes genius. These are valuable goals, but they shouldn't require inverting reality. How many teachers still tell this story, despite decades of correction? How many students draw comfort from a lie? What other genius myths are similarly fabricated to serve narratives we want to believe? The irony is complete. Even Einstein's story was rewritten, his excellence transformed into failure to make a better metaphor. If we'll rewrite the academic record of history's most famous scientist to fit a preferred narrative, what else have we rewritten? From torture devices that never existed to discoveries that never happened. From beliefs never held to quotes never spoken. From execution methods misremembered to words mistranslated. From helmets never worn to instruments never played. From rooms never used to math never failed. We've traced a pattern. These aren't innocent mistakes or simple misunderstandings. They're useful lies. The Iron Maiden was fabricated to make the Middle Ages look barbaric, confirming Enlightenment narratives of progress. Columbus was elevated to hero while erasing indigenous peoples, justifying colonization as discovery. Medieval scholars were portrayed as flat earthers to make modern science look more revolutionary, religion more anti-intellectual. Gladiators became death sport athletes to paint Rome as decadent, confirming moral decline narratives. Vikings got horned helmets for theatrical impact, creating exotic warrior imagery. Nero's singing became fiddling when violins became familiar, creating the perfect metaphor. Salem's hangings became burnings because European imagery is more dramatic, making Puritan America seem more fanatical. Vomitoriums were mistranslated to confirm assumptions about Roman excess, supporting moral superiority narratives. Marie Antoinette was given words she never spoke to justify revolution and vilify monarchy. Einstein's excellence was inverted to create inspirational mythology about unrecognized genius. What connects them? They served purposes: political propaganda, national myths, moral lessons, entertainment value, cultural warfare. Each falsehood reinforced a narrative someone wanted to tell about civilization, progress, barbarism, genius, or decline. They made heroes of colonizers, villains of queens, primitives of scholars, and relatability out of genius. The mainstream view says these are honest mistakes that persisted due to limited information or imperfect translation. Historians have corrected them. Education is catching up to scholarship. The lies are being exposed and eliminated from textbooks, slowly but inevitably. But there's another way to see it. These lies survived, not despite correction, but because they did work that truth couldn't. They were useful. The Iron Maiden made the Middle Ages look backward. Columbus made colonization look like discovery. Flat Earth myths made religion look anti-science. Burning witches made Puritans look fanatical. Vomitoriums made Romans look degenerate. Marie Antoinette's callousness justified revolution. Einstein's failure made genius accessible. The lies shaped how civilizations understood themselves. They created moral lessons, established cultural superiority, justified political actions, and made complex history into simple stories. Even now, after decades or centuries of correction, many persist. The Iron Maiden appears in museums. Columbus Day remains a holiday. People confidently describe vomitoriums and quote Marie Antoinette. The narratives are too useful, too embedded, too perfect to abandon. Most people walk through history believing what they were taught, never questioning the dramatic anecdotes. But you made it here. You watched this far because your mind doesn't accept convenient narratives without examination. You see that every supposed fact has an origin story, and many of those origin stories are propaganda, theater, or misunderstanding ossified into truth. This channel exists for people who refuse to stop asking, who told us this? When? Why? Who benefited when we believed it? These 10 lies are entry points. Once you see how easily history becomes mythology, how facts are invented and spread and taught for generations, you can't unsee it. The archive of human knowledge is vast, but much of it is fiction wearing the mask of fact. So subscribe. Lock in your access to this excavation site. We need minds like yours examining the evidence, questioning the stories, refusing to accept neat narratives. And in the comments, tell us, which of these lies did you believe? Which one shocked you most? What other historical facts should we investigate next? Which pieces of common knowledge do you suspect are complete fabrications? Let's see who can build the strongest case. The floor is yours. History isn't written by the victors. It's written by everyone who had something to gain from a particular version of events. The Iron Maiden that never tortured, the discovery that never was, the flat earth nobody believed, the death matches that rarely happened, the horned helmets never worn, the fiddle that didn't exist, the burnings that never occurred, the room mistranslated, the words never spoken, the failure that never was. We built entire civilizations on lies and taught them as truth for centuries. Question everything. Trust nothing without evidence, because the past isn't fixed. It's still being written, and right now, at this moment, someone somewhere is inventing the next historical fact that will be taught for the next 200 years, unless people like you catch it first.